In this presentation, we'll go over the basic skills and practices necessary for effective communication. The first idea to think about is communication as an emotional bank account. In other words, just like your bank account for your finances, sometimes we make deposits and sometimes we make withdrawals. And in communication, basic deposits are things like kindness, keeping promises, honoring expectations, loyalty, and apologies when necessary. In other words, this builds up the respect and trust that we have with people with whom we're communicating. On the other hand, when you make withdrawals, such as unkindness, breaking promises, violating expectations, duplicity, and showing too much pride, we often diminish the trust and respect that we have with others. And when this happens, it makes communication much more difficult with the people that we're working with. By making deposits, we build a reservoir of goodwill and trust that enables us to communicate more effectively with others. On the other hand, when we take withdrawals, we separate ourselves from other people and lose whatever benefits our relationship with them might have brought us. Take a moment and think about the kinds of withdrawals you may have taken in the last year and what your quote-unquote current balance of your emotional bank account is with the people that you work with. Another aspect of effective communication is acknowledging different perspectives. Let's try a little experiment. What do you see in this picture? Do you see an old lady or a young lady? How about in this picture? Do you see a nun or a frog or a fist? Finally, what about this one? Do you see a beggar or a smiling man? The point of this activity is just to reiterate the idea that we can all be looking at the same picture or problem or situation, but yet see it from a very different perspective. And by acknowledging that fact, we open the door for communication. Let's just talk about some basic suggestions for communication. Discussions go more smoothly when one of the parties is willing to be the first to understand. In other words, when one person is willing to take a step back and really listen and try to understand what the other person is communicating. To understand another person, we must be willing to be influenced. Approaching a communication situation with a steadfast mind will not allow communication to go smoothly. When we are open, we give people room to release their fixed positions and consider alternatives. Seeking first to understand lets us act from a position of knowledge. By seeking to understand, we gain influence in the relationship. A term that's very important in communication is empathy. The definition of empathy is the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experience of another of either the past or present without having the feelings, thoughts, and experience fully communicated in an objectively explicit manner. Empathy is also the capacity for this kind of understanding. To truly understand someone, we must listen to more than words. Empathy is listening with the eyes and the heart. In other words, also taking into account the emotions that someone is bringing to the communication table. Empathetic listening is deep listening, followed by statements of what we understand the other person to be expressing. Empathetic responses can guide both people to understanding. And empathetic listening allows other people to explore their feelings at their own pace and direction. We often fall into a pattern of engaging in communication whereby we respond with autobiographical responses. These types of responses can keep us or prevent us from understanding another person. Autobiographical responses are basically interpreting what someone else is saying through our own personal lens. It often comes out in things like evaluating kinds of statements, which is judging, asking probing questions that sometimes directs someone to answer how we want them to or how we think they should. It often comes in the form of providing advice or telling others what they should do. And finally, autobiographical responses are interpretive in nature, explaining why people behave the way that they do. These kinds of statements often are not intentional. It is inevitable because of the lens we use to understand the world. Let's take a minute to practice identifying some different autobiographical responses. So in the top box, we have the 4 different kinds of autobiographical statements, and then at the bottom of the screen are 4 sample statements. Take a minute and pause the presentation if you need to, and try and match the type of autobiographical response to the appropriate statement. Now take a minute to check your answers. As you are reading these statements, hopefully you can see how, although they're not intended to be ways to shut down communication, they can often make the other person not want to communicate. And so we want to move from a place of autobiographical responses to more empathetic kinds of statements. And as we'll see in the upcoming slides, we also have other ways of responding that open the doors of communication rather than close them. To really promote deep and productive communication, there are some basic skills. Listening actively, really trying to understand and listen to what the other person is saying. This would include things like making eye contact, nodding to show the person that you're listening, definitely putting down our cell phones and laptops and iPads so that we can really be engaged in the conversation. Reflecting throughout the conversation. So this might be providing paraphrases of what someone says to make sure the understanding is there, and reflections of emotion. Asking questions. And these are not the probing kind of questions we learned about with the autobiographical responses. These kinds of questions seek to get more information or to clarify what someone is saying. And finally, summarizing. So putting the conversation into a summary so that both parties can agree that is what were the main points and that there's no misunderstanding. In terms of partnership building skills through communication, it's very helpful to use accepting kinds of statements, to provide compliments or appreciation statements. Again, to use those empathetic kinds of statements that we learned about earlier. Focusing statements to really get the conversation down to a place where both people can be working on an idea in a focused manner. Agreement statements and productive solution statements. And we'll learn more about some of these kinds of statements in other presentations in this module. Thank you.